All right.
Okay.
My name is Izzy Carney, and I'm here with Sally Canzoneri at the closing reception for the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities exhibition, Legacy Civil Rights at 60. Today is March 1st, 2024. Sally has agreed to take a few moments to tell us a little bit about her history and how that story is related to civic action. So Sally, do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your earliest memories of civic action. And take as much time as you need to think of things. Like, this is all on the spot.
Okay.
So.
I mean, especially being in DC, it's kind of funny. I grew up in rural Vermont. Okay. I grew up in Vermont, and Vermont was all even more rural than it is rural now. So I guess, and my parents, I mean, you can't, it was a small town, about 500 people. So even as a child, I went to town hall, town meeting cool. Once a year. That is what you did, and my parents were civically active. My mother was on the school board, and my father was a town selectman. And so I think we just grew up expecting we would, and pretty much expect to be involved in things. So, and then in high school, class, whatever, offices and stuff. So I guess you'd say that when I was in college, well, actually, my first job, actually, when I was in college, one of my summer jobs was actually working for the Office of Economic Opportunity, writing a welfare rights manual. So I was already doing some stuff, and then my first job out of college was what was called a community planner. I worked as a liaison between community groups and the planning department in Minneapolis, and I was also, Minnesota still had caucuses then. So I went to in '72, which was the first year I could vote for president. I went to caucuses, and I was a representative to the district Democratic convention that chose delegates to go to the state convention, which would choose delegates to go to the national convention. So, the Ward 6 club, whatever. So, kind of expected to do kind of that sort of thing.
So civic action was an integral part of.
I mean, pretty much, and I was head of the Judiciary Board, and I was the captain of the fire department at my college.
Wow.
So, so I guess, it was just part of doing things as one went along. My first experience of DC was in the winter of '67, so this was the year before the riots, and that's when I lived in Adams Morgan with a group of students on Mitwood Place, and I worked for someone who was doing a program to begin to train it wasn't full home rule, but there was a transition going on, and worked for someone who was doing seminars for people who were taking over district government to talk about government things.
Wow.
So it was seeing some of that going on. So let's see, where else do we go? Anyway, we were in Minnesota because my husband had gone back to graduate school there, and then we moved to Illinois, where we lived for a while, and I went to graduate school and law school. Then we moved to Washington, and that was when we moved to Mount Pleasant.
Gotcha.
So I guess that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I will jump a ways ahead to when I then had, once we had and I mean, we voted, we did things. Once we had a child, it became inevitable to be on the PTA and selling gift wrap and all sorts of that kind of stuff at various times.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I've jumped all over the place.
No, this is great.
And then in more recent years, so I mean, it's come and gone and been involved in a number of things and also arts organizations. And then in recent years, probably since at least 2004, but earlier, I have been a volunteer doing election protection work on the National Election Protection Hotline to promote voting rights during various campaigns. So I've done an awful lot of that.
Yeah.
I'm not doing PTA anymore. 'Cause, yeah. I did a lot of PTA, did a lot of volunteering in schools. I did a lot of teaching kids, tutoring kids for National History Day projects as a volunteer. So yeah, a lot of that.
Well, I'm
kind of
glad
thing.
you touched on those too, because civic action isn't just political necessarily. It's also community driven and, you know, touches all parts of life.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a different kind of civic action. Tell us about a significant protest experience that you have participated in, if any, and paint a vivid picture of where you were, who you were with, and what cause you were supporting.
In college, I wasn't always one for protests. In college, I did go to one of the big anti-war protests in New York. And somehow or other, a friend and I, this was a huge march up, I don't know New York City's streets that well, huge march up. And somehow or other, we got near the UN and we got separated. And we were between a barricade and a car. We managed to get out. But anyway, but then I didn't do as much. However, what has happened in the last few years was in my artwork, I have gone to photograph a lot of demonstrations. That's what I was telling you, just like the piece I have here, that is, I did a whole series of pieces. I had this idea, I was approved, I had been doing pieces that matched historic places with present day. I had started out doing those lenticulars, the pieces like I have out here, doing a present day and historic location. And then I was set up to do, I was going to be doing a solo show at the Art League in 2018. And it was to be past and present, but what with the election of 2016, I thought it'd be really important to kind of juxtapose two sides, but it was harder to find sides in Washington. And I ended up doing a whole series of pieces where I used historic photos of, I went to a lot of demonstrations to photograph. I did participate in some, like the Women's March, but others, I was also there, you know, to photograph and be supportive. So, but so I ended up doing a whole series of pieces that match historic photos with present day photos of demonstrations and marches. I mean, that's only one. And actually, they have in the art bank. I did one of the women's pairing the 2017 Women's March with women from the 1913, when Wilson was first sworn in, Women's Suffrage March, and then there's another that is one of my favorites, which is a combination of photographs of gay federal workers demonstrating at the White House with gay federal workers marching in the 2017 Gay Pride Parade. I've done a series which are interesting to do. So,
well, let me ask
I've focused a lot on demonstrations in Washington and thought a lot about the role of demonstrations in Washington. Yeah.
I'm glad you bring up your art, because I would love to hear, for you as an artist, first of all, you know, how long would you consider yourself an artist? Like, what was that like for you? And then how did civic action become kind of the center of your art? Was that always the case?
I did not train as an artist, and I was teaching creative writing to children, and I got interested in artist books because as a way of encouraging literacy. And so I got very interested in doing, and I was doing artist books, and then I was doing photography to have images for the artist books. And anyway, I didn't start doing much serious exhibiting until like 2013, 2014. And I was doing mostly photographs, but then I moved into that. And I think the thing is, since I do a lot on built environments, so I do a lot of photographs of buildings, but also as a way of the whole history of it. And since I have a background in urban planning and in law, and I was a history major as an undergrad, in a way that you can see a lot ties together.
Yeah.
I think particularly in recent years, I mean, I don't always try to be very explicitly political. I'm a bit leery of very heavy-handed, but of course you can't do some of the kinds of pieces I'm doing without making some statement and having it come in. And I think everybody right now, in the last few years particularly, I think a lot of artists are wrangling with the question of, does the art, how much does your art matter? How much can you do with your art? How much of a, you're torn between, do I want to just make something beautiful?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
and I do go back and forth. I do some abstract stuff that is just partly to be delighted in the form and the shape and the structure, and not try to get away from the politics. But I also think there is the question of, and lately I've been very interested in the role it plays. I mean, if you read very right-wing, MAGAs really love their memes. I mean,
Memes
there's
as art is
there's a
interesting.
real battle
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
I mean, and the other day I was helping someone set up an Artomatic, and this was one of the painters in the room of these very, very in your face, very clearly where he stands politically. And I'd been looking online and seeing, I mean, I think that also we're at a point where there's a lot of people making a lot of very political art on both ends of the spectrum, and it's influential.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so I don't know. I'm wrangling.
No,
with that
I
question.
feel like every artist wrangles forever with that question. So well, thank you for that. My next question here is, as the nation's capital, DC has always been a hub for protests and direct action. What does it mean to you to live in this region and participate in this legacy? And tell us a DC-specific civic action story that you remember best.
What I was going to say, since I have been to, for years when I first lived in DC, I honestly did not pay that much attention to demonstrations. I mean, I can remember a point where my brother and his then wife came down to be in a big, I don't know if it was anywhere, I've forgotten what it was, quite a long time ago, a demonstration at the Pentagon. And they went out to the demonstration, and I took care of her children that day, which I was perfectly happy to do. Take these little girls to the zoo. I worked at HUD when I first came here, and there would be people who would come out and demonstrate. And I have to say, to be honest, in my sort of cynical government, I don't want to say cynical. It was my job to be neutral. It was my job in that situation. And I went to work for the government because of a sense of civil action. I went to work for the government because I felt that's a place where I could accomplish things. I mean, I really believe in government. I believe in the civil service. And that's where, I mean, I went into law to do things to make people's lives better. And for me, working in government seemed to me more effective than demonstrating. And sometimes we would kind of look at these demonstrations and, for lunchtime entertainment maybe. And I just remember at this time my brother and his wife came, and they come back and we're having dinner, and she says, I think we really got their attention today. And I did not have the heart to say, no, you did not, no. And so I hadn't paid, but having photographed so much in the last few years, and in a period where there have been so many big demonstrations at the same time as we had an administration that really almost aggressively refused to notice them. I mean, and we've had some really big ones, the Women's March and the March for Our Lives, and, you know, they're really big. But also, another thing I've thought about is how much demonstrations accomplish. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the demonstrations that have been most accomplishful in terms of getting what the people doing them wanted and changing people's lives, the two I can think of in the most recent years, one goes longer. One is the March for Life, very consistent every year, very much with a movement attached to them. But then also the other demonstrations that were really amazing were the ones in 2017 to save the ACA. And I took photographs there, and I would see there were these handicapped people who literally were sleeping outside, and if they needed to go to they needed to use the toilet. They were having to wheel their wheelchairs down from Capitol Hill to Union Station. And you had to really admire their courage, and also admire the guy who was there from Move On, who is Ben Winkler, who is now chairman of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. The whole way those were, and that was again part of a more organized. But you really, these people, they were really, I mean, being there the day the House voted to repeal the ACA, and you know, and all those Republican congressmen came out to get on their bus to go to the White House, and to see, you know, the misery. Yeah, that was a striking one to be at. But then also the day that the Senate saved it was also another demonstration. But also then another demonstration that was striking was to be there be up on Capitol Hill the day Kavanaugh was confirmed, when the pain of the crowd was so palpable. I did another piece. With photographs I took that day. Yeah, so it's been interesting, but it does. I don't know. It's really hard to see. Demonstrations do a lot of different things. Yeah. They're in some ways they're sort of reinforcing the faithful. As one years and years ago, I met a minister who said they were sort of like prayer services. And then also, of course, I was also out photographing at the 2020 demonstrations. The piece I have here is is a photograph I took in my neighborhood, actually, then. And so, but it takes so much to go from a demonstration to actual change.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary how much it takes.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
And it's interesting too, DC, and I'm really glad you brought up the pre-home rule, because we're coming up on 50 years of home rule in DC, and this DC being this federal capital, but also just a city where people live and have less rights than folks around the country. Yeah, I'm wondering if you can speak on that a little bit about maybe those differences in civic action.
About DC, and you know, I came here having, as I say, grown up in a very white Vermont, though literally as a child, for Memorial Day services being ceremonies, school events, going then to put flowers on the graves of the Civil War dead, and being taught an abolitionist hymn to sing during that. So, but still, I didn't really, I mean, the years I've lived in DC, I've obviously come to understand much more deeply the whole role of, you know, the role of the racial history of the country plays out. And DC, of course, has things distilled in its own odd way. Right. What I really have noticed about demonstrations, I was thinking about this a lot in 2022 when the truckers wanted to come. I followed them online. I was very interested. Yeah, it was fascinating because an awful lot of their demonstration was online, really. But also DC is it's like the Broadway for demonstrations. Everywhere else is is summer stock.
That's a lovely way to phrase it,
really,
honestly.
Yeah, and you could see that even with, the truckers were a fascinating one because they had all these sort of rallies as they went along. They had a lot of support online. They had an online presence they were building, but they also didn't understand the rules, and there's a certain decorum and rules that most people follow in demonstrations in DC. I think certainly not January 6th, but as a matter of fact, even if you watched the way the demonstrations played out in DC in 2020, other than one or two nights, and frankly the looting going on in Georgetown was opportunistic. I don't think it had anything to do with the demonstrations, with the BLM demonstrations, other than that the police were busy elsewhere, so why not do that? But anyway, but there's normally a procedure and a way people understand the rituals and the rules. And one of the things that was fascinating about the truckers was that they wouldn't just register and go march on the mall without their trucks. And, they had this whole all tangled up in their views. It was interesting to see, but there was still the fact that DC is the big stage. But you'll also see that people don't understand how big a stage it is. People think they're going to come have a massive demonstration, and they don't understand that there are tiny demonstrations here almost every day, and that it takes a huge demonstration to really meaningfully, the spaces are so large that it's not like, the other thing also though, and I don't know how, I presume this is a big change from earlier eras. In general, in my experience, the DC police handle them very well. They manage crowds very well. There was some funny business during the demonstrations in one area in Trump's inaugural. But on the whole, and actually even in 2020, I got to admire the DC police for how calmly and how well they, sometimes, you would see I saw black cops who were standing there, they were holding their line, and they would have black protesters, in their face. Literally in their face. And they still behaved. Yeah, they still did what they were supposed to do. There was one demonstration in 2020, there was one demonstration when the J6 people who still demonstrate down by the, they had a demonstration on the lawn of the Capitol. They had this one demonstration where they were talking about how terrible the Capitol Police were and everything. And the Capitol Police were guarding them. It was and that speaks very well for the society that, they were literally spending their whole time talking about how horrible the Capitol Police were. And at the same time, they expected the Capitol Police to protect them from the one or two anti-protesters who were running around yelling at them. There's this gal, Anarchy Princess, who was running around using a bullhorn at them. So, which does, and I feel like that's the Washington way. It makes you proud of the city that that this kind of discourse this kind of tense discourse can go on and still go on. Yeah.
And be repeated every day, pretty much. As you said, there's always something.
But there are times I went when the Unite the Night, the woebegone little group of Unite the Night guys, the year after Charlottesville decided they'd have a demonstration in Lafayette Square. And they took the metro in, guarded by police, and they were guarded by police to get there. There were anti-demonstrators. And there was a point, they had everything, the fencing, so that they were kept far apart. But all the same, there was one point where I was at the front of the anti-group, who seemed very angry. And I was feeling like I was getting pushed up against this big fencing, and it brought back that experience from New York when the anti-war march, so I kind of backed out and moved on.
Yeah.
I didn't want to really be in the midst of it, but but again, there was a lot of kind of control and understanding. Yeah, so it's,
Right.
but it's one of the problems of being a DC citizen is that even though it's your own hometown, you have to recognize that you're stuck with the fact that it's a symbol and a city, and the symbolism is different to other people from other parts of the country, and everything, just like all of the battles over slavery were fought out here. So many, all of America's biggest problems, sooner or later, get debated, discussed,
Right.
demonstrated about in Washington, D.C. I mean, that's one of the things that makes it special, but it's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
Well,
And
we're a
I've
little.
taken way more
No,
time
you're
than-
okay. I just
yeah.
want to, when we wrap up, like, is there anything else you want to add? Anything else?
No,
you...
no, I think I've gone on for.
Oh no, you
I
can.
think
No,
I've
this
gone
was
on
great.
at more length than probably I should. And
Well, Sally,
also,
thank you
I'm
so
eager to
much.
talk.
This
Yeah,
was a
okay,
really
yeah.
great conversation, and
Yeah, oh,
we
yeah.
appreciate it very much.
Okay,
So thank
can I-
you.
And I can fill this thing out.